How did we get here? We're going to start beginning to talk about the important moment in history when you're talking about the United States and its slavery, which is the Civil War. The Civil War, as most people know, was a moment in which many southern states in the United States sought to secede from the Union because of a growing pressure to end the practice of slavery in the United States as a whole. Now, the reasons for why slavery was beginning to be phased out of law and practice in the United States, they're numerous. The most important ones being that the economy of not just the United States, but the world was beginning to phase into an era of pre modern industrialization, or one may even say early modern industrialization, where the hand labor that was used in the slave trade in order to harvest resources was no longer efficient and no longer necessary. In addition to that, there's also aspects of international pressure, whereas the largest powers in the world, in particular the Empire of Great Britain and the Empire of France, had already phased out slavery in this regard from their societies and from their legal systems. And so that was beginning to weigh on the United States whether or not it would be able to follow suit in a timely manner. Either way, the point is the industrialized North, particularly in New England and in the tri state area, had already long since moved away from being reliant on slavery. As I had mentioned previously on a different slide and in different segments, those states were never completely reliant on slavery, such as the southern states. And so this was a growing pressure that the North was putting on the South to abandon slavery altogether for these economic reasons that I had described. The southern states, which did not want to relinquish what little economic power and authority that they still had, which was still completely reliant on slavery, began to seek alternatives, seeking out long-term plans for how they would be able to continue to use slavery as the bedrock economic foundation to their ways of life and to their economic future, and how they would be able to secede from the United States in order to make this future for their economies and for their culture a reality. So eventually, this would come down to an armed civil war where you had the forces of the Union and the loyal states fighting against the insurrectionist South and the states that formed the new Confederacy. As many people may know, I would certainly hope that the United States was victorious in this conflict, and the Union would, after some certainly grisly and brutal conflict with the destruction of many southern cities, would readmit the southern states into the Union. The Lincoln quote that is most attributed to this is, "Mercy yields sweeter fruit than strict justice." And in doing so, despite the armed action against the Union that the southern states did, they were readmitted into the Union, and many of the same representatives were actually allowed back into their former positions. There was obviously strict tension in this regard between loyalist politicians and former Confederates, but they were indeed readmitted, and that would be very important to understanding exactly how the immediate post-Civil War politics and policies would continue to form. So here we have Abraham Lincoln and some quotes in regards to the motivations and the strengths behind the conflict in the Civil War. And it very much highlights much of what I was saying previously, which is Very much so that the Civil War was a conflict that was fought over first and foremost economic reasons. There are obviously certain interactions and certain individuals that are tied to the Civil War that relate to other such aspects, such as moral objections to slavery. A very famous Union marching song during the Civil War was in honor of John Brown, who was uh, a white man from New England who tried to start a revolt to free slaves in the South. And so there's obviously certain interactions on the ground level amongst individuals that tie into this, but that's a very common thing with war anyway, is that you can always seek to make aspects of war be about moral things on an individual level because that makes something easier to fight for. But as it actually breaks down from the top down, from the commander in chief, in this case being Abraham Lincoln, you can see it. These quotes very much heavily point to everything being about the preservation of the Union and the economic might of the combined United States. So, an important aspect that comes into both things that happened during the Civil War, but especially continuing after the Civil War, is the effect that this would have on freed Black people. So, freed Black people during the Civil War, because of acts such as the Emancipation Proclamation, were often freed to very little. Many freed Black people would join Union armies as they continued south in order to finish their total war against the Confederacy. But even in acts such as that, that offered very little protection from things such as disease and poor quality of living, because oftentimes these were, even marches done without, standard qualities and boots or clothing and things like that. And without having such things like clothing, shelter, medical care. These were issues that would spread rapidly throughout these recently freed Black communities. And this is something that would continue even after the end of the Civil War. Here we have some quotes and some imagery in regards to this, how often it was believed that this was a natural reaction, that these freed Black people were being left to die, left at the mercy of exposure. Released into a society as legally free, but without any protections that one would associate with standard quality of citizenry for any, developed nation of the time. Here we have a specific quote in regards to this, about this belief, about this held opinion that Black people, once freed, certainly this is about getting rid of the institution of slavery, but even without the institution of slavery, it would still allow the Black issue to solve itself. The idea that Black people would vanish. And like his brother, the Indian of the forest, he must melt away and disappear forever from the midst of us. Here we have an important piece of history in regards to the treatment of recently freed people during the Civil War, which is Sherman Field Order number 15. Each family shall have a plot of not more than 40 acres of tillable ground. So this relates to aspects of the Civil War like I was describing. So General Sherman was a Union general that was in charge of continuing and permeating the total war campaign against the Confederacy, burning many southern cities to the ground as the Union Army was making sure to rout and crush the Confederacy as efficiently as possible. And while they were doing so, when they would pass through plantations and such that had large numbers of Black people, they would be liberated from their current positions of bondage And as a military officer, he was able to give field orders such as this about how these freed Black people were to be treated. And this is a specific example of much of what I was describing before about matters of moral interaction being much more about individuals than system or policy. Because this is showing a specific action that was taken by General Sherman as he was there, as he was marching, as he was going through the South through these plantations. And there's lots of record and letters that are often preserved from times such as this from General Sherman to his family back home about his exposure to the conditions of slavery, which he was unfamiliar with being from the North. And so these often point to how these things often happen and levels of individuality, but this is a field order. This isn't a command from Congress passed through the Senate. It's not even an executive order. So outside of the context of an immediate military action taken by this individual, you'll see that it doesn't actually hold much water going forward into history. So when you see what becomes of the land that was promised. So, as many people should know, President Lincoln was assassinated and he was succeeded by Andrew Johnson, who overturned the previously mentioned field order given by General Sherman. And so all of this land that was to be granted to newly freed African Americans was to be immediately returned to the wealthy planter class that previously owned them. Reasons for this obviously have a significant number of backings behind them, including standard bigotry or seeking to take matters of wealth or prosperity to this long since oppressed class, which is an entirely new class also that's being introduced. You have a previous slave class that's now, due to the defeat of the Confederacy, now freed people, but still a previously established and will continue to be established as subservient or even in many cases subhuman class of person. And in addition to that, though, something that can never be denied and must always be remembered when you talk about these things is that it was a matter of political and economic expedience. The planter class of the South was the most powerful social class. They held the majority of the wealth, even after the destruction of much of their property and their plantations and the economic backing that these things were based on. And so, in order to continue to try to hold the Union together and have the Southern states appeased, many matters like this and matters like this were taken in order to continue to seek the approval and the assistance of these powerful social classes in the South. Here we have amendments to the Constitution, very famously, that would be very important for establishing the legal rights of African Americans. So we have the 13th Amendment, which formally abolished slavery. Then we have the 14th Amendment, which gives citizenship officially and equal protection of the law to all citizenry, which now includes African Americans. And then the 15th Amendment, which granted the vote to African American men. So now Black men were able to vote, because obviously at this time women were still unable to vote, so Black women could not vote. But now, as male citizens, African American men were legally permitted to vote.